We share these streets, true tales of everyday folk in bygone Nottingham. Episode 12, The Old Marketplace.
The Old Market Square in Nottingham has one of the most informative and straightforward place names you could hope for. In days when market stalls were as popular as bricks and mortar shops, this was the main venue in Nottingham for shopping. The market also served as a wholesaler, and store owners would buy as much stock at bulk discount as they could afford or carry and then sell on for a profit in their own shops, which may have been out in the suburbs. King Henry II granted a royal charter to the town in 1155 which permitted Saturday markets and allowed traders to arrive the preceding day, which was great news for taverns, hotels and hostelries. In this episode we're going to take a virtual meander around what we now call the Old Market Square and try to plot how the modern layout relates to the marketplace of days gone by. Our starting point will be the top of Exchange Walk near the entrance to the NatWest Bank in 2021. Going back to the 17th century, there was a pond at this spot. More than being a pleasant water feature though, the pond was used as part of a punitive process. The Poultry, the modern street that runs along the south side of the Exchange building, was formerly known as Cookstool Row. This was a reference to the ducking stool that was situated there and used, along with the pond, to punish stubborn, unmanageable, loud or abusive women and dishonourable tradesmen. The victim would be restrained at one end of a device similar to a seesaw. The crowd were then allowed to verbally abuse, kick and pelt the person. After an unspecified period of time, the finale would take place, which saw the victim dunked into the pond via the seesaw 3 or 4 times, frequently with fatal results. This is one of those bizarrely illogical punishments which far outweigh the initial offence. The last person to be subjected to this was reportedly a widow Poynton, who was found guilty of being a scold. The kind of activities that might see a tradesman face a ducking stool included forestalling, or buying up of one type of product to secure a monopoly, regrating, or buying market goods at one price and then reselling for a higher price, and the use of inaccurate weights. On the corner of Exchange Walk is what in 2021 we know as NatWest Bank. This part of the square is South Parade. The building has housed the bank since 1658 when Smith's Bank was established at the site. It's widely believed to be the first bank to be formed outside London. The plaque on the side of the bank reads, "In 1658 Thomas Smith completed the purchase for £210 of premises near to this site, where he commenced trade as a mercer and where the family banking business developed shortly thereafter." Abel Smith II founded further Smith's Banks in London 1758, Lincoln in 1775 and Hull in 1784. A bank in Derby was established in 1806. These Smith's family banks were organised as partnerships until 1902 when they amalgamated with the Union Bank of London. Subsequent mergers with the National Provincial Bank of England in 1918 and the Westminster Bank in 1968 created the present National Westminster Bank plc. Smith family motto: fidelity with industry and with honour. Next door to the bank we have a number of modern buildings, including the Joseph Else, a Wetherspoons pub. It's named in honour of the sculptor who created the now legendary 2 lions that adorn the front of the council house. Joseph studied at the Nottingham School of Art from 1890 to 1900. He returned to teach there around 1919. In 1922 was made principal and during this time created the famous sculptures for the council house. The bust of Samuel Morley at the Arboretum is another work of Else's, and further afield you can find his decorations on the famous Selfridges building on Oxford Street. From as early as 7 a.m. you can see drinkers entering the Wetherspoons pub, no doubt eager to discuss sculpture and Nottingham history over a pint or 5. South Parade in days gone by was known as Timber Hill. It was the site of a grassy bank upon which grew 7 elm trees, felled in 1791. And nearby were saw pits, where timber was converted into planks through incredible hard work by sawyers. By night, the saw pits presented a significant hazard for anyone who was struggling to maintain a straight path. and the town records include many references to inebriated missteps by drinkers of yesteryear. If we follow the perimeter round to the right, ignoring Wheelergate and Friar Lane, which have stories of their own, we'll find ourselves at the western end of the old marketplace known as Beast Market Hill. As the name suggests, this is where livestock was bought and sold. Horses were traded on one part called the Sands, while sheep and cattle pens were assembled each Wednesday and Friday right up until the early 19th century. Today, the idea of having so many animals in a crowded public place would have health and safety champions sweating, and the beast market was quite controversial in its day too. In 1811, shop owners were granted permission to have a causeway with a curbstone built from Friar Lane to Bromley House. The causeway would be lined with posts and chains to prevent escaped animals wandering into shops and fouling the area, which until then had been quite a common occurrence. In 1826, the marketplace was paved and the Saturday cattle market moved to a spot at the junction between Wollerton Street and Parliament Street, close to the modern Theatre Royal. The livestock remained unpopular though, and the market traders continued campaigning for its removal. In 1870, a custom-made site was provided at Burton Lees, which now houses the old Guildhall building. The market was something of a chaotic free-for-all until the paving in 1826, when avenues running east to west were built into the surface. This allowed potential customers to browse stalls easier than before, but came at a literal cost to traders. Their rents increased to cover some of the costs of the resurfacing. In 1905, a statue of Queen Victoria was erected on Beast Market Hill by sculptor Albert Toft. This was moved in 1953 to Victoria Embankment. The statue's location was more or less the opposite side of the road to the bus shelter on Beast Market Hill where you catch a number 48. The website, britishlistedbuildings.co.uk, states that the structure is classed as a Grade 2 listed building. In that part of the marketplace there was something of a tradition of iconic structures. Roughly between the bottom of St James's Street and the bottom of Market Street stood the malt cross. Crosses were used in old markets to help navigation. Certain types of wares were sold around certain crosses, so at the malt cross it was a location for malt, used in brewing, whisky making and vinegar making. It was also a spot where crockery was sold. The malt cross took various forms over the years. It was initially a pillar atop 4 steps, but in 1799 a more elaborate structure was built. The new cross was 4 steps formed of 4 layers of hexagonal platforms. At the topmost platform were 6 pillars supporting a tiled roof. A cupola atop the structure featured 6 sundials arranged as a prism, a stone ball and an iron weather vane. The malt cross became an important spot for people that went beyond trade in malt or crockery. Banns of marriage were read there. John and Charles Wesley preached from its steps. Official proclamations were made there. In August 1802, a man sold his 17-year-old wife and 2 children there. Another man purchased them for 27 shillings and 6pence. Now that would be a great story to tell on the podcast. Market Street extends north from the northwest corner of Old Market Place. It was originally a much narrower thoroughfare than nowadays. It was officially named Sheep Lane, but locals called it Blood Alley on account of the many accidents that occurred due to the incline and narrowness of the street. An unconfirmed local legend has it that in 1865 Blood Alley was to be widened and renamed Theatre Street, since the Theatre Royal was also constructed that year. However, market traders were annoyed and felt that a new street name should reference and publicise the market. The corporation stuck to its guns and an unveiling ceremony was held. The night before, however, a mischievous marketeer changed the official street plaque for one of his own creation, bearing the name Market Street. The story goes that once it had been unveiled, the authorities stuck with the new name. The truthfulness of this tale is open to debate. Would the corporation really be bound to the name on the ceremonial plaque? If the swapped-out street name contained an obscenity, would we now be shopping on Street, or perhaps even Street? Also, did the mischievous marketeer change all the signs saying Theatre Street? Most streets have 4 street signs, 2 at the top and 2 at the bottom, and the legend suggests only one was changed. We'll never know, but it's a nice city legend. If you've listened to episode 6 of the podcast, Tram Tales, You might remember that in the days of Nottingham's horse-drawn trams, horses were kept in a rope enclosure at the bottom of Market Street and fetched when needed to assist on the steep incline up Derby Road. We'll move over to Long Row now, and one of the most iconic buildings in the marketplace, the huge department store on the corner of Long Row and Market Street. At the time of recording, it's Debenhams, but fluorescent posters tell of its closing down sale, so sadly it won't be there for very much longer. In 1846, two brothers named Edward and Robert Dickinson owned a small drapery store on the corner. In 1878, they sold the business to another partnership, Mr. W. Griffin and Mr. J. T. Spalding. Mr. Spalding had trained at the wonderfully named London department store of Marshall and Snellgrove. By 1888, the owners were doing so well that they bought up neighbouring buildings on Market Street and Long Row. Walls were knocked through so that shoppers could remain indoors once they'd entered one shop, and Griffin and Spalding began to resemble a modern department store. If you've ever been inside Debenhams, even recently, you'll know that there are multitudes of small stairs and many oddly shaped nooks and crannies. The reason for these is that the structure is actually many different buildings combined into one, and the strange layout simply echoes the original shops that were swallowed up by the complex. In 1924, a facade of Portland stone was built which presented a uniform front and hid the exteriors of the many original buildings. The business was sold to Debenhams in 1944. However, it continued to be known as Griffin and Spalding for another 3 decades before changing to Debenhams. Beside the old Griffin and Spalding building is a narrow alleyway that few people realise goes all the way up to Upper Parliament Street. It's called Norfolk Place. In days gone by, alleyways like this were commonplace, but over the years got swallowed up and incorporated into refurbished buildings as side entrances or service areas. Whole neighbourhoods could be made up of such lanes, generally referred to as rookeries, which could be dangerous and disorientating for the uninitiated. Pleasingly, the marketplace from 1897 has featured a Watson Fothergill building. It's Queen's Chambers on the corner, perhaps confusingly, of King Street. If you stand on King Street and look up at the eastern face of Queen's Chambers, you may spot a deeply unflattering sculpture of the head of Queen Victoria. It may not have been intentionally bad, and perhaps its altitude indicates an attempt to obscure it without harming the pride of the sculptor. Queen Victoria herself would certainly not have been amused. We're nearing the end of our wander around the old marketplace, and it's drawing to a close where many people begin their wanders, in front of the council house. It's a traditional meeting spot, especially by the Left Lion, but really anywhere along the front of the council house. Before the council house was officially opened on the 22nd of May 1929, the Exchange building stood on the site. This had shops on its ground floor and council chambers above. We'll have an in-depth look at the Exchange in a future episode. In front of the Exchange building was the old Butter Cross, sometimes called the Cheese Cross, where dairy products were traded. If you look up at the modern council house and some of the sculpture adorning the front, you'll notice a triangular area immediately above the columns. This is another Joseph L. sculpture and is entitled Frieze on the Old Industries of Nottingham. Look to the far left and you'll see a figure lying down that represents architecture. In its arms is a small model of the council house itself. It's unconfirmed whether the miniature council house features a miniature frieze with a miniature lion figure holding a miniature council house which features a miniature frieze with a miniature lion figure holding a very miniature council house which features a very miniature frieze with a miniature lion figure holding a very miniature. A marketplace, especially one that lasted over so many decades, will be an incredible theatre for human drama, and in a changing city like Nottingham will be constantly shifting and evolving. It's impossible to capture every aspect of such a place in a short podcast episode, but hopefully we've given you some things to explore and think about when you're next in the neighbourhood. It's easy to overlook the old market square as it's so familiar, so maybe next time you'll give the buildings and layout an extra glance and picture some of those who used the area long before we were around.